What religious rule did your parents follow that got my sister taken by CPS? The social worker's car pulled up to our house on a Thursday afternoon while I was doing homework at the kitchen table. I was 14 years old and had just gotten home from school, my backpack still sitting by the front door where I'd dropped it 20 minutes earlier. Through the window, I watched a woman in a gray pantsuit step out of a white sedan, carrying a leather folder and walking with the purposeful stride of someone who'd done this many times before. My stomach dropped before she even knocked on the door, some instinct recognizing that everything was about to change. Mom answered wearing her long denim skirt and modest blouse, her hair pulled back in the tight bun that Elder Whitfield said demonstrated proper feminine submission. The woman introduced herself as Pauline Vasquez from Child Protective Services, and Mom's face went completely white. My sister Lily was 7 years old and hadn't been to school in 3 weeks. Mom and Dad had been treating her diabetes with prayer and anointing oil instead of insulin, following the teachings of our church, the Covenant of Divine Healing. Pastor Gaines preached every Sunday that modern medicine was a tool of Satan, designed to weaken faith and make believers dependent on worldly solutions instead of trusting God's power. He said that true believers accepted suffering as a test, that healing came through prayer and fasting and absolute faith, never through doctors or hospitals or pharmaceuticals. My parents had believed him completely, removing Lily from her endocrinologist's care 6 months ago, despite my desperate arguments that she needed her medication. I'd watched her get sicker each week, losing weight and sleeping constantly, drinking water by the gallon and still being thirsty. But when I'd tried to tell my parents she was in danger, Dad had said I was letting worldly fear override divine truth, that as the man of the house someday, I needed to learn to lead with faith instead of doubt. Pauline asked to see Lily immediately, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Mom led her upstairs to Lily's bedroom, where my sister lay on her bed barely conscious, her breathing shallow and labored. I followed behind them, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Lily looked tiny against the pink comforter, her face gaunt and her lips cracked from dehydration. Her eyes were half open but unfocused, staring at nothing. Pauline touched Lily's forehead, and her professional mask cracked for just a second, pure horror flashing across her face, before she pulled out her phone and called 911. She told the dispatcher they needed an ambulance immediately for a child in diabetic ketoacidosis, her voice urgent but controlled. Mom started crying and saying they'd been praying, that God's timing was perfect, that they just needed to have faith. Pauline turned to her with an expression of barely contained rage, and said that if Lily died, Mom would be charged with negligent homicide. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, paramedics rushing up the stairs with equipment and questions. They checked Lily's blood sugar, and one of them swore under his breath when he saw the reading, over 600 milligrams per deciliter, when normal was under 100. They started an IV line right there in the bedroom, pushing fluids and insulin while asking Mom how long Lily had been symptomatic. Mom kept saying they'd been treating her with prayer, and one of the paramedics looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. They loaded Lily onto a stretcher, moving with controlled urgency that made my chest tight with fear. I grabbed my jacket and tried to follow them downstairs, but Pauline stopped me with a hand on my shoulder. She said I needed to stay here while she talked to my parents, that Lily would be taken care of at the hospital. Through the window, I watched the ambulance pull away with lights flashing but no siren, which somehow felt worse than if they'd been screaming down the street. Dad came home 20 minutes later to find Pauline sitting at our kitchen table with a stack of forms and a recording device. He'd been at his job as an electrician and still wore his work clothes covered in drywall dust. Pauline explained that CPS was opening an investigation into medical neglect, that Lily's condition was life-threatening and appeared to be the direct result of withheld medical care. She asked Dad directly why he'd stopped his daughter's insulin treatments, and he launched into the same sermon we'd heard from Pastor Gaines about faith healing and trusting God's plan and rejecting worldly medicine. He spoke with the authority he used when leading our family devotions. The voice that said questioning him meant questioning God. Pauline listened with an increasingly stony expression, taking notes in her folder. When Dad finished, she informed him that Lily would be placed in emergency protective custody once she was stabilized, and that a court hearing would be scheduled within 72 hours to determine permanent placement. Mom collapsed into a chair, sobbing that they were just trying to raise their children according to God's word, and Pauline said God's word didn't include killing kids through negligence. The detective arrived an hour later, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Raymond Corso, who specialized in child abuse cases. He interviewed my parents separately, recording their statements about why they'd denied Lily medical care. I sat in the living room pretending to read while straining to hear the conversations happening in the kitchen and my parents' bedroom. Dad's voice carried through the walls, defiant and certain, explaining that he was exercising his religious freedom and parental rights as the spiritual head of the household. He cited Bible verses about faith healing and said that man's laws didn't supersede God's commands. Detective Corso's responses were quieter, harder to make out, but I caught phrases like criminal charges and reckless endangerment, When he interviewed Mom, she cried through the whole thing, saying she'd had doubts, but Dad and the church leaders had assured her they were doing the right thing, that submitting to her husband's spiritual authority was her biblical duty. She kept asking if Lily was going to die, and Corso's careful non-answer made my blood run cold. They came for me last, asking me questions about what I'd witnessed and whether I'd tried to get help for Lily. I told them everything. How I'd begged Mom to take Lily to the doctor, how I'd researched diabetic ketoacidosis on the school library computers and printed out articles showing how dangerous it was. I showed them the papers I'd hidden under my mattress, medical information I'd collected, hoping to convince my parents. I explained about our church and Pastor Gaines's teachings about faith healing, about the other families who'd pulled their kids out of medical care. Corso's expression darkened as I talked, and he asked for the church's address and the names of other families following the same practices. I gave him everything I knew, feeling like I was betraying my community, but knowing Lily's life depended on someone telling the truth. My voice cracked when I admitted I'd almost called 911 myself a week ago, but chickened out, scared of what Dad would do if he found out I'd gone against his authority. Pauline squeezed my shoulder when I finished and said I'd done exactly the right thing, that speaking up probably saved my sister's life. The hospital called at 9 that night with an update. Lily was in the pediatric ICU, critically ill but stable, her blood sugar slowly coming down under controlled medical care. The doctors said another day without treatment would likely have been fatal, that she'd been within hours of complete organ failure. They were keeping her sedated while they corrected her electrolyte imbalances and treated the acidosis that had built up from weeks of inadequate insulin. Mom wanted to go to the hospital immediately, but Corso explained that she and Dad were restricted from visiting Lily without CPS supervision due to the ongoing investigation. The hospital had been instructed to call security if they showed up. Mom's anguished wailing filled the house, this primal sound of a mother being separated from her dying child. And despite everything, I felt my heart break for her. She'd been wrong, dangerously wrong, but she genuinely believed she was protecting Lily's eternal soul by following Dad's leadership and prioritizing faith over medicine. I didn't sleep that night, lying in my bed and staring at the ceiling. The house felt wrong without Lily's presence down the hall, the silence heavy with absence. I kept replaying the last 3 weeks, all the moments I could have done something differently. I'd called the school counselor twice, but both times I'd backed down when they'd started asking direct questions, too scared of what would happen to our family if I officially reported my parents. Dad had always told me that men protected their families, that loyalty meant keeping private matters private, that involving outsiders in family business was a betrayal of everything he'd taught me about being strong. I'd thought about calling 911 myself, but worried that I'd be taken away too, that I'd lose my home and my parents and everything familiar. The guilt ate at me, the knowledge that my cowardice had let Lily get this sick before anyone intervened. If I'd been braver, if I'd been willing to stand up to Dad sooner, she wouldn't be fighting for her life in the ICU right now. The court hearing happened on a gray Monday morning in a windowless room that smelled like old carpet and stress. Judge Franklin Ortega presided, a stern-faced man in his 60s who'd apparently seen every variation of parental failure. My parents sat with a court-appointed attorney named Dwight Teller, who looked overwhelmed before proceedings even started. Pauline presented CPS's case, medical records showing Lily's diabetes diagnosis 2 years ago, documentation of regular treatment until 6 months ago, then a complete cessation of care. She played portions of the recorded interviews where my parents explained their faith-healing beliefs, Dad's voice confident as he described denying his daughter life-saving medication in service of God's higher plan. The hospital's pediatric endocrinologist testified via video call, explaining that type 1 diabetes was fatal without insulin treatment, that prayer couldn't replace medical science, that what my parents had done constituted severe medical neglect. Judge Ortega's expression remained neutral, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his pen. Teller's defense centered on religious freedom, arguing that my parents had a constitutional right to raise their children according to their sincerely held beliefs. He cited case law about parental rights and religious exemptions, trying to frame the situation as government overreach into a family's private faith practices. Judge Ortega interrupted him mid-argument to ask point-blank whether he was seriously suggesting that religious belief gave parents the right to let their children die from treatable conditions. Teller stammered that wasn't what he meant, that there were nuances and complexities, but the judge cut him off again. Ortega said that religious freedom ended where child welfare began, that no belief system justified withholding life-saving medical care from minors who couldn't consent to their own potential death. The ruling was swift and absolute. Lily would remain in state custody until further notice. My parents would have only supervised visitation, and they would be required to complete parenting classes focused on medical neglect before any reunification could be considered. The criminal charges came down 3 days later. The county prosecutor, a woman named Veronica Ashford, who'd built her reputation on protecting children, filed charges of felony child abuse and reckless endangerment against both my parents. The press conference was broadcast on local news. Ashford, standing behind a podium full of microphones explaining that religious beliefs didn't exempt anyone from basic responsibilities to keep their children alive. She said this case represented a broader pattern of medical neglect in certain religious communities, and her office was committed to investigating similar situations. The news story included footage of our house, reporters standing on the sidewalk describing the parents who'd nearly killed their daughter through faith healing. My phone exploded with messages from kids at school, some supportive, but many cruel, calling my family crazy and asking if I was also a religious fanatic who rejected medicine. The guys on my basketball team stopped passing me the ball during practice, like my parents' crimes had infected me somehow. Pastor Gaines called an emergency church meeting that Wednesday night, packing the sanctuary with worried families who'd also pulled their children from medical care following his teachings. I went with my parents, sitting in the back pew and watching the performance unfold. Gaines stood at the pulpit in his expensive suit, his voice booming through the sound system as he declared that my family was being persecuted for their faith. He said Satan was attacking the covenant of divine healing through worldly authorities, that the charges against my parents were spiritual warfare designed to intimidate true believers. He called for the congregation to rally behind us, to donate to a legal defense fund, to stand firm in their rejection of medical intervention, no matter what threats the government made. People were crying and shouting, "Amen," swept up in the narrative of religious persecution. I felt sick watching them, knowing that Lily had nearly died because of these exact teachings, but seeing the congregation double down instead of questioning whether their beliefs might be wrong. The man sitting next to me leaned over and whispered that his son had juvenile arthritis, and he'd stopped the kid's medication 3 months ago, following Pastor Gaines's counsel. He said his boy was in constant pain now, could barely walk some mornings, but he was trusting God to heal him in his perfect timing. I asked if he'd heard about what happened to Lily, and he nodded, saying he was praying for our family's strength during this trial of faith. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. This man watching a child nearly die from medical neglect and interpreting it as confirmation to continue endangering his own son. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, pulling out my phone and photographing the Legal Defense Fund poster in the hallway. It showed my parents' faces under bold text, declaring them prisoners for Christ and asking for donations to fight their persecution. The casual martyrdom of it made me want to punch something. Lily woke up on day 5 in the hospital, confused and scared but alive. The social worker called to tell me, saying Lily was asking for me and I could visit under CPS supervision. Mom and Dad were allowed to come too, but only one at a time with a social worker present. I went first, taking the bus to the hospital alone and finding my way to the pediatric ICU. Lily looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and monitors, an insulin pump attached to her stomach. She burst into tears when she saw me, reaching out with shaking hands. I hugged her carefully, avoiding the IV lines and electrode wires, and she asked why Mom and Dad hadn't come, why she'd woken up in a hospital when the last thing she remembered was being in her bedroom. The social worker, a younger woman named Tasha Reed, gently explained that Lily had been very sick, and the doctors had to help her, that she was safe now and getting the medicine she needed. Lily's questions came rapid fire, her 7-year-old mind trying to make sense of what had happened. She asked if she'd done something wrong, if God was punishing her for not having enough faith. My throat closed up hearing her blame herself. This little kid who'd been taught that her body's failure to produce insulin was somehow a moral test. I told her firmly that she hadn't done anything wrong, that she had diabetes and needed medicine to keep her healthy, that none of this was her fault. She looked confused, saying Pastor Gaines had told everyone that sickness came from weak faith, that true believers could be healed through prayer alone. I wanted to tell her that Pastor Gaines was a liar who'd nearly killed her with his dangerous theology, but Tasha caught my eye and shook her head slightly. Instead, I said that sometimes people were wrong about things, even adults who seemed certain, and that the doctors knew how to help her feel better. I held her hand and tried to be the protective big brother Dad had always said I should be, except this time protecting her meant acknowledging that Dad himself had been the threat. The next hour was brutal, watching Lily slowly realize that she wouldn't be going home with Mom and Dad, that she'd be staying in foster care while the court case proceeded. She asked why over and over, her voice getting higher and more panicked, until Tasha finally explained in simple terms that Mom and Dad had made a mistake by not getting her medicine, and the social workers needed to make sure she stayed safe. Lily started crying that she wanted Mom, that she didn't understand why being sick meant she couldn't go home. I held her and tried to comfort her, but how do you explain to a 7-year-old that your parents' religious beliefs nearly killed her? How do you tell your little sister that the people who were supposed to protect her had instead chosen doctrine over her life? Tasha gave Lily some coloring books and put on a Disney movie, trying to distract her, but Lily just curled into a ball and sobbed. Mom's supervised visit was worse. She came in crying, trying to hug Lily and pray over her, saying God had allowed this trial to strengthen their faith. Tasha had to physically intervene when Mom tried to remove Lily's insulin pump, insisting that prayer was the only healing my sister needed. Security was called, and Mom was escorted out of the room still praying loudly about spiritual warfare and satanic medical systems. Lily was hysterical after that, asking why Mom was acting crazy, why she'd tried to take away the medicine that was making her feel better. I tried to explain that Mom believed something different about how sick people got better, but my words sounded hollow even to me. How do you defend the indefensible? Dad's visit was canceled after Mom's incident, CPS deciding that neither parent could be trusted alone with Lily, even under supervision. The investigation expanded after a tip from someone at the church. CPS started looking into other families in the congregation who'd withdrawn their children from medical care, focusing on kids with chronic conditions that required ongoing treatment. Within 2 weeks, they'd opened cases on 6 more families, including the man with the son who had arthritis. The local news ran a series of reports about the Covenant of Divine Healing, interviewing former members who described the intense pressure to reject modern medicine. One woman talked about how her daughter had suffered for months with an untreated ear infection that permanently damaged her hearing, all because Pastor Gaines had convinced her that antibiotics were tools of the devil. Another family described watching their son's asthma get progressively worse after they threw away his inhaler, until he'd finally had an attack severe enough to require an ambulance. The common thread in every story was that questioning Pastor Gaines's teachings meant risking social exile from the only community these families knew. Detective Corso requested the church's financial records as part of his investigation, and a pattern emerged that made the whole situation even more sinister. Pastor Gaines was paying himself a salary of $250,000 annually from congregation donations, lived in a mansion worth over $1 million, and drove luxury cars while his followers struggled financially. The legal defense fund for my parents had raised almost $30,000 in less than 2 weeks, but none of that money was going to their actual legal defense. Instead, it was deposited in church accounts that Gaines controlled personally. He'd built an empire on vulnerable people's faith, enriching himself while preaching that his followers should reject worldly wealth and medical care. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. This man telling his congregation to trust God alone while he accumulated massive material wealth for himself. The news about the financial exploitation broke during a Sunday service, reporters confronting Gaines with documentation of his spending as he arrived at the church. The video went viral, Gaines in his tailored suit trying to explain why he deserved a $250,000 salary, while families in his congregation couldn't afford their children's medications. He claimed that his prosperity was evidence of God's blessing, that successful ministry required resources, that his critics were jealous of his anointing. The congregation started fracturing immediately, some people defending him while others began asking questions they'd been afraid to voice before. My parents fell firmly into the defender category, insisting that Gaines was being persecuted by satanic forces working through the media. They couldn't or wouldn't see that they'd been manipulated by someone who valued their money more than their children's lives. Dad kept saying that as men of faith, he and Pastor Gaines had to stand together against the world's attacks, that backing down now would be spiritual cowardice. Lily's foster placement was with a family experienced in handling kids with chronic health conditions. Margaret and Louis Okoye had raised 3 kids of their own and fostered dozens more, specializing in children who needed complex medical care. They lived in a modest house filled with books and pictures, a trampoline in the backyard, and a golden retriever named Biscuit, who immediately adopted Lily as his new favorite person. The Okoyes were patient and kind, teaching Lily how to check her blood sugar and recognize the signs of high or low glucose. They made managing her diabetes feel normal instead of shameful, celebrating her successful readings and troubleshooting problems without judgment. Tasha sent me photos of Lily smiling on the trampoline with Biscuit, looking healthier than I'd seen her in months. The images were bittersweet, relief that she was safe mixed with grief that she'd been taken from our family. The preliminary hearing for the criminal charges happened on a cold morning in early December. The courtroom was packed with members of the Covenant of Divine Healing, filling the gallery to show support for my parents. Pastor Gaines sat in the front row, making a show of praying loudly before proceedings began. The prosecutor, Veronica Ashford, presented medical evidence of Lily's condition when she'd been admitted to the hospital. Photographs showing her emaciated state and lab results documenting her near-fatal blood sugar levels. The pediatric endocrinologist testified again, explaining in devastating detail exactly how close Lily had come to dying, that she'd been experiencing early organ failure when the paramedics found her. The defense tried to argue that my parents hadn't intended to harm Lily, that their actions were based on sincerely held religious beliefs, but Ashford countered that intent was irrelevant when a child's life was at stake. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Nina Shah, a pediatrician who'd treated Lily before my parents pulled her from medical care. She testified that she'd explicitly warned them 6 months ago that stopping Lily's insulin would kill her, that there was no alternative treatment for type 1 diabetes, that prayer couldn't replace pancreatic function. She'd documented their refusal to continue care in Lily's medical records, including notes about their insistence that faith healing was superior to medicine. She'd filed a report with CPS at that time, but somehow it had fallen through bureaucratic cracks and never been investigated. If that initial report had been taken seriously, If someone had intervened 6 months ago, Lily would never have gotten sick enough to require hospitalization. The system had failed her before my parents did, and that realization sparked its own investigation into why CPS hadn't acted on Dr. Shaw's concerns. Judge Ortega bound my parents over for trial on all charges, denying their request for bail reduction. The prosecution argued they were a danger to Lily if released, and the judge agreed. My parents would remain in custody until trial, which was scheduled for early February. The members of the Covenant of Divine Healing erupted in outrage, shouting about religious persecution and constitutional violations. Pastor Gaines stood up and started preaching about spiritual warfare, his voice booming through the courtroom, until Judge Ortega had him removed by bailiffs. The whole scene was chaos, people crying and praying and accusing the judge of serving Satan. I sat in the back row watching my community fall apart, these people I'd grown up with revealing themselves as unable to distinguish between religious freedom and criminal neglect. The church had become a cult of personality around Pastor Gaines, and anyone who questioned him was cast out as faithless. I was placed with my Uncle Derek, my dad's younger brother who'd left the church 10 years ago after his own crisis of faith. He lived 3 hours away in a small apartment above a hardware store, working as a mechanic and living quietly outside the drama of religious community. Derek hadn't spoken to Dad in years, their relationship destroyed by theological disagreements and Derek's refusal to submit to the church's authority structure. But he didn't hesitate to take me in when CPS called. He set me up in his spare bedroom and let me work through my anger in his garage, teaching me basic car maintenance and giving me space to process what had happened. He'd been through his own deconstruction of faith, leaving the Covenant of Divine Healing after watching the same patterns of manipulation and control that had nearly killed Lily. He understood the cognitive dissonance of loving people who believe dangerous things, the grief of losing your community when you started asking questions they couldn't answer. School became impossible after the story went national. News outlets picked up the case as an example of religious extremism endangering children, running pieces that featured our family photos and detailed descriptions of Lily's near death. Students who'd been friendly before started avoiding me, not wanting the association with the guy whose parents were facing felony charges. Teachers gave me sympathetic looks, but didn't know what to say, their discomfort palpable. I'd walk down hallways hearing whispers, seeing kids pull up news articles on their phones and point at me. Someone spray-painted "Psycho Family" on my locker, the words dripping red like blood. The principal had it cleaned immediately and promised to find who did it, but the damage was done. I stopped going to lunch, spent free periods hiding in the library, left immediately when the final bell rang. Derek offered to let me transfer to a school in his district, and I accepted gratefully. The trial began on a frigid February morning, the courthouse surrounded by protesters from both sides. Members of the Covenant of Divine Healing held signs declaring religious freedom and parents' rights, while counter-protesters carried photos of children who died from faith-healing practices and signs reading, "Medicine saves lives," and "Your rights end where child abuse begins." The national attention had turned the trial into a referendum on religious freedom versus child welfare, with pundits and activists descending on our small city to argue their positions. I sat in the gallery next to Derek, watching my parents at the defense table looking small and confused. They'd aged dramatically in the past few months, gray hair and deep lines I didn't remember. Dad's confident authority eroded by isolation and mounting evidence. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They called medical experts who explained that type 1 diabetes required insulin replacement, that prayer couldn't stimulate pancreatic function, that denying treatment was medically indistinguishable from poisoning. They showed photos of Lily in the ICU, her tiny body dwarfed by machines, her face gaunt from weeks of inadequate treatment. They played the 911 call, Pauline's urgent voice demanding an ambulance for a child in ketoacidosis, while Mom prayed loudly in the background. They presented the financial records from Pastor Gaines's accounts showing the exploitation, proving that his faith-healing doctrine had enriched him personally. Each piece of evidence built on the last, creating an overwhelming picture of parents who'd chosen ideology over their daughter's life. The defense called character witnesses who testified about my parents' devotion to their faith, their involvement in church activities, their genuine belief that they were protecting Lily's eternal soul. Pastor Gaines testified about the biblical basis for faith healing, citing verses and explaining the theological framework that had guided my parents' decision. He spoke with the same commanding authority I'd heard every Sunday, the voice that had convinced hundreds of people to reject medical care. But under cross-examination, Ashford got him to admit that he personally saw doctors when sick, took prescription medications for high blood pressure and diabetes, and had recently undergone surgery for a herniated disc. His hypocrisy was exposed in real time. This man who preached rejection of medicine while privately benefiting from it. The jury's expressions shifted from neutral to hostile, recognizing the manipulation at work. Gaines tried to explain that his situation was different, that he had a special calling that required him to stay healthy to lead the church, but his words sounded hollow even to the believers in the gallery. My testimony came on day 4 of the trial. Ashford walked me through everything I'd witnessed, my attempts to get help for Lily, the medical research I'd hidden under my mattress, the phone calls to the school counselor that I'd backed out of from fear. I explained how Pastor Gaines's teachings had permeated every aspect of our family life, how questioning them had been presented as a failure of faith and masculinity. Dad had always told me that real men led with spiritual authority, that doubting the church's teachings meant I was weak and effeminate. I described watching Lily get sicker each day while Mom and Dad prayed harder, convinced that her deteriorating condition was a test they needed to pass. The defense attorney tried to suggest I'd been influenced by secular education to reject my family's beliefs, but I shut that down immediately. I said I believed in God, had prayed desperately for Lily's healing, but recognized that God had given us medical knowledge for a reason. Rejecting medicine wasn't faith, it was negligence dressed up in religious language. The verdict came back after 3 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts for both parents. The jury forewoman read each verdict with a steady voice while my parents sat motionless at the defense table. Mom started crying silently, tears running down her face without sound. Dad stared straight ahead with no visible reaction, his jaw clenched tight. Judge Ortega scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks out, remanded them back to custody, and dismissed the jury with thanks for their service. The Covenant of Divine Healing members in the gallery erupted in shouts of injustice, several people having to be escorted out by bailiffs. Pastor Gaines tried to approach the defense table but was blocked by court security, his face red with rage as he shouted about appealing all the way to the Supreme Court. The whole scene was pandemonium, the collision of absolute certainty with legal consequence. The sentencing hearing was quieter, most of the church members having lost interest once the verdict came down. Judge Ortega listened to impact statements from Dr. Shah about the trauma of watching preventable suffering, from the Okoyes about Lily's recovery and ongoing adjustment, and from me about losing my family to ideology. I stood at the podium and talked about what it meant to watch your father choose doctrine over his daughter's life, to realize that the man who'd taught you about strength and leadership had demonstrated neither when it mattered most. My voice cracked, but I kept going, needing them to understand that this wasn't about religious persecution. It was about children dying because adults prioritized their beliefs over basic care. Judge Ortega then delivered a sentence that was both harsh and measured. 5 years in prison for Mom, 7 years for Dad due to his role as the primary decision-maker and spiritual authority in the household, followed by supervised probation and permanent prohibition from having unsupervised contact with minor children. He said their actions had nearly killed their daughter, that religious belief didn't excuse criminal negligence, and that the community needed to understand that faith healing without medical backup was child abuse. Lily stayed with the Okoyes, the permanency plan shifting from reunification to long-term foster care with potential adoption. At 9 years old now, she'd spent 2 years learning to manage her diabetes confidently, thriving in school, and slowly processing the trauma of what our parents had done. Tasha arranged visits between us twice a month, supervised meetings at a neutral location where Lily and I could maintain our sibling bond. She'd grown taller, healthier, more confident, the scared 7-year-old replaced by a resilient kid who checked her blood sugar without prompting and corrected adults who misunderstood type 1 diabetes. She asked about Mom and Dad sometimes, her memories of them fading into something abstract. Margaret and Lewis had become her real parents, the people she ran to when she had nightmares or needed help with homework. The grief of losing our original family structure had softened into acceptance of this new reality. The Covenant of Divine Healing fractured completely after the trial, members splitting between those who doubled down on faith-healing doctrine and those who started questioning everything they'd been taught. Pastor Gaines was eventually charged with fraud and tax evasion related to the misappropriated legal defense funds, adding federal crimes to his growing list of consequences. The church building was sold to cover legal judgments, the congregation scattered to other churches or abandoning organized religion entirely. Several families who'd withdrawn their children from medical care quietly resumed treatment, ashamed they'd believed someone so obviously corrupt. Others moved to different states and joined similar groups, unable to accept that their beliefs might have been wrong. The human capacity for self-deception, for choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, proved remarkably resilient. I graduated high school early, taking extra courses and summer classes to escape faster. Derek helped me apply to colleges far from our hometown, places where nobody knew my story. I was accepted to a small technical school on the West Coast with a decent scholarship, the admissions essay about surviving religious extremism apparently compelling to the selection committee. Derek drove me to campus in August, helping me move into my dorm room and meeting my roommate. As he hugged me goodbye, he said he was proud of how I'd survived, that speaking up had saved Lily's life, even when it cost me everything else. I watched him drive away and felt the weight of the past 3 years settling into something manageable, not gone, but no longer crushing. I'd built a new life from the ruins of my family, and maybe that was its own kind of healing. Mom wrote letters from prison that I couldn't bring myself to read, pages of justification and requests for forgiveness stacked in a drawer unopened. Dad remained silent, his certainty apparently immune even to incarceration. Lily drew pictures of her new family, crayon versions of Margaret and Louis and Biscuit that she mailed to me at school with notes about learning to ride a bike and joining the Girl Scouts. The religious rule that got my sister taken by CPS had destroyed our family but saved her life, a brutal calculus that I'm still learning to accept. Sometimes faith requires believing that medical science is how God answers prayers, and rejecting that wisdom is just arrogance dressed in holy language. Lily turns 10 next month, and I'm flying home to celebrate with her real family, the people who chose to love her enough to keep her alive. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.